You are just a numbers person who never faced real risk, Elena. So stay out of the real defense business before you cost this family a relationship. My brother-in-law laughed as he poured another glass of wine at Sunday dinner, certain he had put me in my place. He thought my time in the Army was a technicality. He had no idea the paperwork sitting in my briefcase was the classified gate access log to my old military base, proving his company was billing the government for phantom employees. To understand how his casual insult ended in a congressional subpoena, I have to go back. My name is Elena. I am 35 years old. Before I carried a leather briefcase into a federal building, I spent 8 years wearing the uniform of the United States Army. I was a logistics officer. When most people picture the military, they picture fighter jets, infantry charges, and medals pinned on chests. They rarely picture the invisible, massive machine that keeps those operations moving. In the Army, logistics is not just about counting boxes. It is the blood flow of the entire mission. If my supply chains failed, a forward operating base went without water, or a convoy stalled on a hostile road waiting for diesel fuel. My commanders taught me early on that bullets and bandages do not magically appear in a combat zone. They get there because someone verified the route, checked the cargo, and did the math. Facts over feelings. That was the doctrine I stood by. You cannot bluff a supply chain. The numbers always tell the truth. Today, I serve my country in a different uniform. I traded my combat boots for sensible heels and a tailored gray suit. I work in Arlington, Virginia as an auditor for the Department of Defense Inspector General. It is a quiet job. I spend my days looking at spreadsheets, cross-referencing defense contracts, and making sure taxpayer dollars actually buy what the private civilian contractors promise to deliver. We track millions of dollars down to the single cent. Most of the contractors we review are honest, hard-working Americans. Some of them are not. If you believe that true patriotism is about quiet integrity and protecting the system from those who try to exploit it, I hope you will stick around for this story. And if you have ever had to bite your tongue while an arrogant person tried to explain your own job to you, consider subscribing to the channel. The most arrogant man in my life was my husband's older brother, Mark. My husband, David, is a middle school history teacher. He is a gentle, trusting man who has always idolized his older brother. Mark was everything David was not. Mark was loud, charismatic, and aggressively ambitious. 5 years ago, Mark started a defense subcontracting firm. He acted as a middleman, providing civilian support staff to military bases for facility maintenance, motor pool operations, and perimeter support. At first, it was a modest business, but over the last 2 years, Mark had transformed from a moderately successful businessman into an obnoxious caricature of sudden wealth. He bought a massive 7-bedroom house in a gated community in Alexandria, complete with a custom pool and an outdoor kitchen. He traded his standard pickup truck for a luxury imported sports utility vehicle that cost more than $100,000. He began taking expensive golf trips and buying his wife, Sarah, diamond jewelry for no particular reason. All of this struck me as odd. I monitored defense budgets as my profession. The national defense budget was shrinking. Base commanders were tightening their belts. Contracts were getting downsized. Subcontractors all over the country were laying off workers just to survive. Yet somehow, Mark was swimming in cash. He was also completely insufferable. Mark loved to play the patriot, especially at our family barbecues. He would stand on my patio holding a pair of silver tongs and talk loudly about his deep personal friendships with base commanders. He used military jargon he had learned from action movies. He called himself a critical asset to the defense of the nation. But Mark had never served a single day in his life. When I was around, he went out of his way to diminish my background. He viewed my time as a logistics officer as secretarial work. He would introduce me to his wealthy friends at holiday parties with a patronizing pat on the shoulder. He would say I was in the army, but I just counted staplers. He told people I did not see the real action, not like the guys his company supported. I never took the bait. Not because I was afraid of him, because I knew arguing with a fool only proves there are two. Silence. I would just smile, take a sip of my water, and ask about his golf handicap. Discipline is about controlling your own reactions when others try to provoke you. Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. You do not waste energy fighting battles that do not matter. David would look at me apologetically, knowing how much it bothered me, but I always told my husband to let it go. We loved Sarah, and we adored their 2 young daughters, my nieces. I wanted to keep the peace for their sake. Mark mistook my discipline for submission. He thought my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. He believed that because I did not brag, I had nothing to be proud of. He was entirely wrong. My work at the Inspector General office was meticulous. Every quarter, a randomized list of government defense contracts was generated by our internal system for routine audit. We looked for compliance. We looked for waste. Most of the time, we found honest clerical errors, a miscalculated overtime rate, a duplicated purchase order. We would issue a report, the company would correct the error, and everyone moved on. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday morning in late October. The sky outside my office window was the color of wet iron. The building was quiet, filled only with the hum of the ventilation system and the clatter of keyboards. I was sitting at my desk, drinking my second cup of black coffee out of my favorite faded army mug. My supervisor, a retired Navy captain with silver hair and a very low tolerance for small talk, walked down the narrow aisle of cubicles. He dropped a heavy manila folder onto my desk. The paper landed with a dull thud. It was the new quarterly rotation of compliance reviews. I broke the red tamper seal on the folder and pulled out the first file. It was a logistics support contract for base maintenance. I looked at the location. Fort Belvoir. My heart did a slow, strange rhythm. Fort Belvoir was my old stomping grounds. I knew every gate, every motor pool, and every warehouse on that installation. I knew the physical layout like the back of my own hand. I had spent 3 years of my life running logistics from that exact soil. I dragged my finger down the printed page, looking for the primary vendor information. I needed to see which private company held the multi-million-dollar agreement. The words were printed in crisp, black ink. Orion Defense Group. It was Mark's holding company. I sat perfectly still. The noise of the busy office around me seemed to fade into a low hum. My brother-in-law, the man who mocked my service, the man buying luxury cars during a budget crisis, was the prime vendor on a government contract at my former base. And the federal oversight system had just randomly assigned his entire financial life to my desk. I did not panic. I did not immediately run to my supervisor to claim a conflict of interest. A lesser auditor might have rushed to dump the file, but my training kicked in. I looked at the invoice summaries attached to the back of the file. The dollar amounts were staggering. Mark was billing the government hundreds of thousands of dollars a month for civilian contractors who were supposedly doing heavy maintenance inside the secure perimeter. I shut the folder. I pressed my palms flat against the cool surface of my desk. I knew I had to open the detailed ledgers. And I knew that once I turned that page, the peace in my family would be gone forever. I opened the ledger. The first rule of a federal audit is emotional detachment. You do not look for a villain. You do not look for a hero. You look for variables. You leave your personal history at the door. I forced myself to forget the expensive imported watch Mark wore on Sunday. I forced myself to forget his loud, patronizing laugh. I had to treat his file exactly the same way I would treat a file from a stranger in a different state. I began by pulling up the submitted invoices for the last fiscal year. The paperwork was immaculate. Everything was filed on time. The columns were perfectly aligned. The totals matched to the penny. Mark was billing the Department of Defense for 50 full-time civilian maintenance specialists. According to the contract description, these men were responsible for servicing heavy tactical vehicles and maintaining motor pool infrastructure deep inside the secure perimeter of Fort Belvoir. It was specialized work. It was dirty work. And because of the heavy equipment, Mark was permitted to bill an elevated rate for hazardous duty conditions. According to the federal payout schedule his company was receiving, just under $400,000 every single month for this specific crew alone. I tapped my pen against my desk. Something was wrong. It was not a glaring error. It was a subtle friction, a discrepancy that only someone who had actually run those specific logistics would feel. I looked at the billed hours. The crew was logging 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week. That meant 50 men were supposed to be turning wrenches in the motor pool from dawn until dusk, week in and week out. But I knew the Fort Belvoir motor pool. I knew its physical dimensions. I knew its capacity. The maintenance bays there were built during a different era. They were cramped. There were only 20 active bays. If you tried to pack 50 full-time civilian mechanics into that space, alongside the active-duty military mechanics who were already assigned there, they would be tripping over each other. It would be a logistical nightmare. It was physically impossible to employ that many men in that small of a footprint for those kinds of hours. The math was perfect, but the physical reality was impossible. I needed a second set of data. An invoice is just a promise that work was done. A time card is just a piece of paper that anyone can sign. If you want to know the truth about a military base, you do not look at the money. You look at the gates. Every single person who enters a secure military installation must swipe a federally issued identification card. Civilians, contractors, soldiers, and generals. It does not matter who you are. The gate guard scans your card, and a central server logs your entry and your exit down to the exact second. I turned in my office chair and opened a secondary secure terminal on my desk. I logged into the Joint Access database. It is a slow, archaic system with a blue screen and white block letters. I typed in the contract code. I requested the raw gate access logs for the 50 men listed on the hazardous duty payroll. It would take a few hours to compile. I used the time to meticulously build out the rest of the spreadsheet. I needed to know if these were just honest, sloppy clerical errors made by a bad payroll manager, or if this was deliberate, massive fraud. Would Mark realize who was auditing his company before it was too late? I knew the automated system might send a routine data notification to his base liaison. I had to work fast, but I had to work smooth. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I returned to the main screen just before noon. The database had finished compiling. A massive spreadsheet waited on my monitor. The left column listed the names of the 50 mechanics on the payroll. The middle column listed the total hours he had billed the government for their labor over the past 18 months. The right column listed their physical gate swipes at Fort Belvoir. I scrolled down to the first name, John Miller. Mark had billed the government for 2,000 hours of labor for John Miller. The gate access log for John Miller was completely blank. He had never scanned onto the base. Not once. My breath caught in my throat. I scrolled to the next name. David Ramirez, 2,000 hours billed, 0 gate swipes. I scrolled faster, name after name after name. Out of the 50 men Mark was billing, for only 12 had ever actually set foot on the base. Those 12 men were logging normal 40-hour work weeks. The other 38 men did not exist. They were ghost employees. Mark had invented them. He had submitted fake names, fake identification numbers, and fake time cards. He was billing the United States military hundreds of thousands of dollars a month for a phantom workforce that was supposedly performing hazardous duty. He was not just skimming a few dollars. He was stealing millions of taxpayer dollars in broad daylight, relying on the fact that no one in the massive federal bureaucracy would bother to cross-reference the invoices with the physical perimeter logs. I sat back in my chair. The screen glowed against my face. The true source of Mark's newfound wealth was suddenly very clear. The money for his imported sports utility vehicle. The money for Sarah's diamond jewelry. The money for his massive house. It was not earned through brilliant business strategy. It was siphoned directly out of the pockets of the American taxpayer. Sometimes betrayal is loud. Sometimes it is a screaming match or a slammed door. But sometimes betrayal is very, very quiet. It is just a column of zeros on a blue screen. Mark had used my husband's trust to elevate himself in our family. He had used my own military background as a punchline to make his wealthy friends laugh. He had looked me in the eye and told me I did not understand real risk, while he was secretly committing massive federal fraud right under our noses. I finished matching the rest of the records, feeling the cold weight of what I held in my hands. The dozens of men Mark had been billing hazardous duty pay for had not swiped onto the base in nearly 2 years. They were ghost employees. The following Sunday, David and I drove out to Alexandria for family dinner at Mark and Sarah's house. The weather was unseasonably warm for late October. The sky was clear and the neighborhood smelled like burning oak leaves and expensive barbecue. Mark had hired a professional landscaping crew that morning just to blow the leaves off his massive driveway before we arrived. I parked our modest sedan next to his gleaming imported utility vehicle. My stomach felt like a block of ice. In the world of federal auditing, the moment you uncover massive fraud involving a family member, standard procedure dictates you must immediately recuse yourself. You flag the conflict of interest, hand the file to a supervisor, and walk away. It is designed to protect the auditor from emotional compromise. It is designed to keep your hands clean. But I had not recused myself yet. I had spent the last 4 days building an airtight, irrefutable matrix of the ghost employees. I wanted the file to be so perfect that when I finally handed it over, no expensive defense attorney could ever pick it apart. I had brought the burden of that knowledge right to their dinner table. We walked into the backyard. Mark was standing by his custom stone outdoor kitchen, holding a large glass of wine. He was talking loudly to a neighbor over the low hum of outdoor speakers. His daughters, my 2 young nieces, were running across the manicured grass. David immediately dropped his jacket and ran to chase them, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile. David loved this family. He idolized his older brother. He believed Mark was a self-made genius who had finally achieved the American dream. I stood near the edge of the patio watching them. The automated federal system operates on a rigid schedule. When an auditor pulls a massive amount of secured access logs, a digital notification is sometimes generated and sent to the base liaison officers. I knew Mark was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. A smart defense contractor keeps an ear to the ground. He knew his sector of defense logistics was suddenly under the microscope. He just did not know who was looking through the lens. Mark noticed me standing alone and walked over. He wore a crisp linen shirt and a heavy gold watch that caught the afternoon sun. He sighed loudly, playing the part of the exhausted, highly important businessman, burdened by his own success. "Crazy week, Elena," he said, pouring himself another glass of wine. "You government types are really tightening the screws right now, aren't you?" I kept my voice perfectly level. "Routine compliance reviews happen, Mark. It is just part of the cycle," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "It is a witch hunt. My liaison at the Pentagon called me on Friday. He said some pencil pusher in Arlington pulled our sector for a random review. Can you believe that? A random review." He leaned in closer. He smelled like expensive cologne and grilled meat. He looked at me with that familiar, patronizing smirk. He assumed that because I was family, and because he viewed my military service as mere clerical work, I would naturally sympathize with his plight. "You know how it is. Mark continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume. The military is a mess. We contractors are the only ones keeping the lights on. Sometimes you have to bend the rules just to get the job done. But these auditors, they have no real-world experience. They do not understand the pressure. My guys are out there doing heavy, dangerous work to keep those bases running. We take the risks. And some bureaucrat thinks they can just question my billing? It is an insult. I looked at him. I looked past his gold watch and his expensive linen shirt. I saw a man who was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars every single month from the very system I had sworn an oath to protect. If your paperwork is clean, Mark, you have nothing to worry about, I said quietly. His smirk vanished. His face darkened. He did not like that answer. He did not like being corrected, especially by me in his own backyard. The mask of the charming, wealthy host slipped, revealing the bully underneath. He wanted to remind me of my place. He thought his wealth and his loud voice gave him automatic authority over my quiet discipline. He assumed I would back down to preserve the precious family harmony. He leaned forward. The patio grew very quiet. David and Sarah were chatting near the back door out of earshot, but the neighbor was watching. This was the moment. You are just a numbers person who never faced real risk, Elena. So stay out of the real defense business before you cost this family a relationship. He spoke the words softly, the cruelty laced through every single syllable. Silence. He stared at me, waiting for me to flinch. He was begging me to stay out of his business, completely unaware that he had just insulted the specific federal auditor holding his entire financial life in her hands. Would I recuse myself to save my husband's family from the fallout? Would I protect the peace, or would I follow the evidence to its conclusion? I did not argue with him at the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my drink in his face. I did not threaten him or defend my military honor. Discipline is about controlling your own reactions when others try to provoke you. I simply looked at him for a long, quiet moment. You are right, Mark, I said. My voice was completely calm. The numbers are my job. I will stick to the numbers. I turned and walked away. Mark laughed behind me, victorious. He thought I was retreating. He thought I was finally admitting defeat. He was completely wrong. I survived the rest of the dinner with polite, terrifying silence. I smiled for the photos. I hugged my nieces tightly. On the drive home, David noticed I was quiet, but he assumed Mark had just gotten under my skin again. I did not tell him the truth. Not yet. I needed the machine to be in motion before the emotional storm hit our house. Monday morning arrived with a hard frost. I walked into my office building in Arlington before the sun was fully up. I turned on my desk lamp and pulled the heavy manila folder from my locked drawer. The file was now thick with printed gate logs, highlighted cross-references, and a summarized executive memo detailing the exact mechanics of the massive fraud. I did not take the file to my immediate supervisor to claim a simple conflict of interest. Instead, I walked down the long, quiet hallway to the secure wing of the building. I stopped at a heavy wooden door marked with a brass plaque. It was the office of the Federal Investigative Unit. I knocked twice. The door opened. I walked inside and placed the unredacted audit directly onto the center of the senior investigator's desk. I am formally flagging this contract for criminal investigation, I said. I have uncovered a massive phantom payroll scheme at Fort Belvoir. Furthermore, I must disclose that the prime vendor is a direct relative by marriage. I am handing over all collected evidence and requesting immediate federal escalation. By bypassing the standard internal review and handing it directly to the investigative unit, I locked the audit into the permanent federal oversight track. It could not be buried. It could not be quietly settled with a slap on the wrist. I had crossed the point of no return. Once a massive federal fraud investigation begins, the wheels of government move in absolute, terrifying silence. Because I had officially flagged a direct family connection standard protocol, required me to recuse myself from the final decision-making authority. However, because my preliminary audit was so deeply detailed, and because I was a former logistics officer who intimately understood the physical layout of the compromised base, the Federal Investigative Unit asked me to remain attached to the case as their primary technical advisor. My partner in this quiet war was a man named Arthur. Arthur was a retired military lawyer, a former judge advocate general who had spent 30 years prosecuting defense fraud. He was a calm, gray-haired man who drank black tea and spoke in a very low, measured voice. Arthur did not care about the drama of my family dynamic. He only cared about the data. For the next 4 months, Arthur and I worked in complete secrecy inside a secure, windowless room in Arlington. We meticulously traced the forged signatures on the time cards. Arthur issued silent, sealed subpoenas to the regional banks that held Mark's corporate accounts. We discovered that the money the government paid out for the ghost employees was being routed through a complex web of dummy vendor accounts before finally landing in Mark's personal wealth management portfolio. The financial trail was incredibly dense, designed to look like legitimate subcontractor payouts, but the math was undeniable. Winter settled over Washington. Thanksgiving passed. Christmas came and went. The hardest part of those 4 months was not the long hours tracing spreadsheets. The hardest part was going home. David and I still attended Sunday dinners at Mark's house. I had to sit across the table from my brother-in-law, eating his food, while secretly helping the federal government build a massive criminal indictment against him. It felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon in the dark. I watched Mark brag about his business. I watched him continue to act like the smartest man in the room. He remained completely arrogant, utterly convinced that his wealth made him untouchable. He still called me a numbers girl. He still mocked my military service. I maintained perfect, devastating silence. I never gave him a single clue. I let him talk. Overconfident men always talk too much. If you appreciate stories about quiet discipline winning out over loud arrogance, this might be a good time to leave a comment down below. Have you ever had to sit quietly and watch someone dig their own grave, knowing you held the shovel? Let me know your thoughts, because I read every single one. The first massive cracks in Mark's foundation appeared in late February. The investigative unit did not announce their presence. They did not send a warning letter. They simply triggered a bureaucratic mechanism known as a payment suspension order. They froze every single federal transaction bound for his company, pending an administrative review. The immediate financial consequences hit Mark's bank accounts like a sledgehammer. He had structured his entire lavish lifestyle on the assumption that the stolen government money would never stop flowing. His massive mortgage, his luxury car lease, his country club fees, all of it relied on the hundreds of thousands of dollars arriving on the 1st of every month. When the 1st of March arrived, the money did not. I was sitting in our living room reading a book when David's phone rang. It was late on a Thursday night. David answered, and I heard Mark's voice on the other end. He was panicked, his words tripping over each other. He told David the Pentagon had frozen his accounts over an administrative hold. He said they would not give him a straight answer. He claimed it was a massive clerical error and that he could not make payroll the following week. He could not pay the mortgage on his massive house. David tried to calm him down, offering to loan him whatever we had in our savings. I listened to my husband, a man who drove a modest sedan and packed his own lunch for his teaching job, offering to empty his bank account to save his millionaire brother. I set my book down. I felt a flash of cold anger. Mark was not just stealing from the government. He was willing to let his own brother bleed for his lies. I told David we could not mix our finances with a defense contractor under administrative review, and thankfully, he listened to me. Over the next few weeks, Mark's untouchable facade completely shattered. His luxury imported sports utility vehicle was quietly repossessed. The expensive landscaping crew stopped coming to his house. He complained constantly to my husband about a massive bureaucratic witch hunt. He blamed incompetent government workers. He blamed liberal politicians. He blamed everyone except himself. He hired an expensive team of defense attorneys in Washington, assuming he could simply bully his way out of the administrative hold. He did not realize that the federal government does not care about expensive lawyers. His loud threats to sue only cemented the case against him. He still did not know the truth. He still believed I was just a bitter relative. He had no idea that I was the exact reason his bank accounts were drying up. By April, the scope of the theft had grown too large for a quiet internal review by the Inspector General's office. Arthur pulled me into his secure office on a rainy Tuesday morning. He slid a summary brief across his desk. The paper was stamped with a red seal. "The Department of Justice is preparing criminal indictments," Arthur said quietly. "But before they move, a Congressional Oversight Subcommittee has formally requested the entire file. They are holding public hearings on defense contract waste next month on Capitol Hill." I looked down at the brief. The story had grown far beyond our office. "They want to make a very public example out of him," Arthur continued. "The committee is issuing a subpoena for Mark to testify under oath, and they have also issued a subpoena for the primary technical expert on the initial audit trail." Before I could answer, a man in a dark suit walked into the office. He was a federal courier. He bypassed the reception desk and walked straight toward us. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with the crest of the United States Congress. He handed the envelope to me. "You are going to Washington," Arthur said. "You are the one who built the physical evidence matrix. You are the one who proved the physical impossibility of the work hours. The committee wants you to explain it for the official congressional record." I picked up the heavy envelope. I felt the weight of the thick paper in my hands. Mark had told me to stay out of the real defense business. He had mocked me as a numbers person who never faced real risk. He had laughed at me in his backyard. Now I was holding a formal congressional summons. I was going to Capitol Hill to serve as the primary expert witness against him on live television. The Rayburn House office building sits just south of the United States Capitol. Its hallways are vast, echoing corridors lined in polished marble and deep mahogany. When you walk through those halls, you can feel the heavy machinery of the federal government grinding forward. It was late May. The cherry blossoms were long gone, replaced by the humid heat of a Washington summer. I walked through the public security checkpoint, my sensible heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. I wore a tailored dark suit. My hair was pulled back. I carried a single slim leather portfolio. The hearing for the House Subcommittee on Defense Contracting Oversight was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. The room was expansive. A long, curved wooden dais sat at the front, elevated high above the floor where the elected officials would sit. Directly below them was a single witness table covered in green felt, flanked by rows of seating for the press and the public. I took my seat quietly in the second row, directly behind the main witness table. Arthur sat beside me, his hands folded in his lap. The room was buzzing with the hushed, urgent voices of political staffers and defense journalists. At 10 minutes to the hour, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber swung open. Mark walked in. He was flanked by 3 highly paid defense attorneys wearing expensive suits. Mark looked completely different from the man who had laughed at me in his backyard. The massive financial strain of his frozen bank accounts and the looming federal investigation had carved deep lines into his face. He looked pale and exhausted. Yet, as he took his seat at the witness table, he tried to project his old, arrogant swagger. He adjusted his tie and forced a confident smile for the television cameras lined up along the wall. He did not look over his shoulder. He did not scan the gallery. He had absolutely no idea I was sitting 10 feet behind him. He assumed this was just high-stakes political theater. He assumed his lawyers had prepared a brilliant defense strategy centered around clerical ignorance. They were going to claim that the billing discrepancies were unfortunate administrative errors caused by a massive, confusing military bureaucracy. They expected to charm the politicians, negotiate a minor penalty, and go back to business as usual. At exactly 10 o'clock, the committee chairman, a stern former judge from the Midwest with silver hair and a very low tolerance for corporate waste, struck his wooden gavel. The sharp sound echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling, instantly silencing the murmurs. This committee is convened to investigate systemic fraud within the Department of Defense logistics contracting sector, the chairman began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Specifically, we are examining the billing practices of the Orion Defense Group regarding hazardous-duty payroll at Fort Belvoir. Mark sat stiffly, his hands folded on the green felt table. His lead attorney leaned forward to a microphone. "Mr. Chairman," the attorney said smoothly, "my client is a dedicated patriot. Any discrepancies in his payroll are merely routine administrative errors. The government's current administrative hold on his accounts is an overreach by civilian bureaucrats who do not understand the complex physical realities of heavy motor pool logistics." It was the exact same loud arrogance Mark always used. He thought he could bluff a room full of politicians by claiming to be the only real expert. The chairman did not smile. He simply stared down at Mark. "Is that right?" the chairman asked. "You believe the federal auditors lack the real-world experience to understand your operations." "I believe," Mark said, leaning into his own microphone, "that the numbers being pushed around by desk workers do not accurately reflect the dangerous work my men do." The chairman slowly closed his thick binder. "Well," the chairman said softly, "let us ask the auditor who flagged your account. The committee calls the primary technical advisor from the Department of Defense Inspector General to the witness table." The chairman looked up from the table. He looked past Mark, directly into the second row of the gallery. "Ma'am, if you would please step forward to the secondary witness microphone." I stood up. The sound of my chair sliding back seemed incredibly loud in the quiet chamber. I picked up my leather portfolio. I walked past the row of expensive defense attorneys. I stepped up to the podium, standing exactly 3 feet away from my brother-in-law. Mark turned his head. His eyes went incredibly wide. The forced, confident smile instantly vanished. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stared at me with absolute, terrifying shock. He looked like a man who had just watched solid ground turn into air. I did not look at him. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I looked directly up at the elevated dais, meeting the eyes of the chairman. "Please state your name and credentials for the official congressional record," the chairman instructed. "My name is Elena," I said. My voice was calm and steady, carrying clearly through the massive room. "I serve as a senior technical auditor for the Department of Defense Inspector General. Prior to this role, I served 8 years as a logistics officer in the United States Army, with 3 years of direct operational experience managing supply chains and secure perimeter access at Fort Belvoir." A low murmur rippled through the press gallery behind me. The television cameras zoomed in. Mark slumped down in his heavy leather chair, his hands visibly trembling. His attorneys frantically whispered to each other, suddenly realizing the massive federal trap they had walked into. "Thank you for your service to this nation," the chairman said respectfully. Then his face hardened as he picked up a manila folder from his desk. "I have your unredacted audit trail right here," the chairman continued, his voice echoing through the chamber. "And I am going to read it into the official record. Orion Defense Group billed the federal government for 50 full-time hazardous duty mechanics, but according to your cross-referenced physical gate access logs, 38 of those men never scanned an identification badge at the perimeter." The chairman looked down at Mark with pure contempt. 38 of the men you billed this country for were ghost employees," the chairman boomed. "They never entered the base. You fabricated their identities and forged their time cards to steal millions of dollars from the American taxpayer." The chairman looked back at me. "Is this physical evidence matrix accurate, Auditor?" "It is mathematically and physically irrefutable, Mr. Chairman," I replied perfectly. "The numbers do not lie." The silence in the room was absolute. Mark's legal defense was completely dismantled on live television. His expensive lawyers could not claim a simple clerical error when faced with an airtight matrix of forged gate access logs built by a veteran logistics officer who knew the base layout better than they did. The evidence was crushing. A small correction in the numbers had become a complete collapse of his story. Mark looked up at me from his table, his eyes wide with a sickening realization. He had mocked me as a numbers person. He had told me I never faced real risk, and in return, I had quietly built the exact ironclad evidence that had just destroyed his entire life on live national television. The silence in the massive congressional chamber was absolute. Mark sat frozen at the witness table. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His expensive defense attorneys immediately began frantically packing their briefcases. They were smart men. They realized in a matter of seconds that their client had just been caught committing massive federal fraud on live television, and that the federal government had an airtight, mathematically flawless case. They also realized they were probably not going to get paid. The chairman struck his heavy wooden gavel against the dais. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber, finalizing the end of Mark's arrogant reign. The committee formally adjourned the hearing, immediately referring the unredacted evidentiary file to the United States Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The federal government operates a lot like a heavy transport convoy. It takes a very long time to gain momentum. But once it starts rolling down the hill, absolutely nothing can stop it. 2 days after I read the physical access logs into the congressional record, federal agents arrived at Mark's corporate office in Alexandria. They carried empty cardboard boxes and federal search warrants. By the end of the week, the Orion Defense Group was completely dissolved. The Department of Defense blacklisted the company, permanently barring Mark from ever bidding on a federal contract again. A federal grand jury formally indicted my brother-in-law on dozens of counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and theft of government property. Because the audit matrix was entirely built on physical access logs and forged time cards, there was no complex legal loophole for him to squeeze through. Faced with the overwhelming reality of the numbers, Mark accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 60 months in a federal penitentiary. To pay the massive federal restitution he owed the taxpayers, the government seized everything. They seized his custom-built house with the outdoor kitchen. They seized his remaining bank accounts. His luxury sports utility vehicle had already been repossessed. His wealthy friends, the ones he used to brag to at his lavish weekend barbecues, entirely abandoned him. When a loud, arrogant man falls from grace, there is always a strong temptation to stand over the wreckage and demand an apology. There is a temptation to remind him of every cruel thing he ever said. I never did that. I never visited Mark during his legal proceedings. I never once picked up the phone to remind him that he had been completely dismantled by a woman he called a mere numbers girl. Revenge is a loud, messy emotion, and I do not deal in messy feelings. I deal in logistics. I deal in facts. The system worked exactly the way it was designed to work. The stolen taxpayer money was stopped. The fake contracts were severed. That was justice. The consequences fell squarely on Mark because of his own greed, not because of any malice on my part. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was the quiet wreckage left behind in my own family. When the news broke, my husband David was completely crushed. He struggled to accept that the older brother he had idolized his entire life was a fraud. David realized that Mark had not only stolen millions from the country, but he had been willing to let our own family go bankrupt to cover his tracks when the initial payments were frozen. I spent many quiet evenings sitting on our back porch with David, helping him navigate the deep grief of that betrayal. But true loyalty is not about protecting a guilty man from the consequences of his actions. True loyalty is about catching the innocent people who fall when the lies collapse. Sarah Mark's wife was completely blindsided by the criminal charges. She had believed her husband's stories of brilliant business success. When the government seized the massive house in Alexandria, Sarah and my 2 young nieces were left with absolutely nothing. I did not let them face it alone. David and I rented a moving truck. We drove to Alexandria and helped Sarah pack up the few personal belongings the government allowed her to keep. We did not lecture her. We did not act morally superior. We simply folded boxes and carried bags. We helped Sarah move into a modest, affordable apartment in our neighborhood. We paid for their groceries. We helped my nieces enroll in a new school. We spent our weekends sitting in their small living room playing board games and making sure those 2 young girls never felt abandoned by their family. We stepped up to rebuild the peace that Mark had shattered. Today, I still wake up before the sun. I still drink black coffee out of my faded army mug. I still take the train into Arlington, put on my tailored gray suit, and sit at my desk at the Department of Defense Inspector General office. My work is quiet. It is invisible to most people. I spend my days tracking massive ledgers, cross-referencing vendor accounts, and making sure the physical reality matches the paperwork. I still stand by my doctrine. Bullets and bandages do not magically appear in a combat zone. They arrive because someone verifies the route, checks the cargo, and does the math. Some people will always confuse volume with strength. They believe that if they yell loudly enough, or flash enough money, or brag about their connections, they can bend the truth to their will. They think they can intimidate the quiet people in the room. They assume that if you do not brag about your past, you have nothing to be proud of. But true service is not a bragging right. It is a quiet, continuous act of discipline. Arrogance is incredibly loud, but the truth is incredibly patient. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. The most dangerous person is the one who understands how the machine actually works. If you build your entire life on a foundation of lies, you should be very careful who you dismiss. You never know who is quietly holding the physical access logs. And when the dust finally settles, the numbers always tell the truth. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If you believe that true strength comes from restraint and that quiet accountability always wins out over loud arrogance, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to sit quietly while someone entirely underestimated your abilities, knowing all along that you held the upper hand? I would love to hear your story in the comments section below. I read every single one. Next time, I will be telling you about a veteran nurse who noticed a terrifying silent pattern of missing medication at a small-town hospital, and the powerful local administrator who thought he could force her into silence. Stay steady out there, trust the process, and I will see you in the next one.